taught the early church leaders that the Lehigh colony landed in South America, we have created this series of videos. Our theories and research is based on the truths from the Book of Mormon, but should not be considered as official church doctrine. This is the fourth part of the four-part series of the Temple of Nephi and the Temple of Koricancha. The Temple of Nephi is the focal point of the city of Nephi and the crowning achievement of this wonderful prophet king, the Church of Santa Domingo. In 1560, the Catholic priests of the Dominican order were given the Temple of Koricancha by Hernando Pizarro, Francisco Pizarro's brother, who received it in 1536 in the first dispersal of lands and buildings to the Spanish conquistadors. The priests built a church and monastery over the sacred temple using the smaller stones from the temple and temple walls to build their own church. The church was destroyed twice by earthquakes, once in 1650 and then again in 1953. This is a picture of Hernando Pizarro that received the Temple of Koricancha in the first dispersal. Each time the church was rebuilt, the cathedral, but the walls of the temple remained perfectly intact and without any damage from the earthquakes. When it was rebuilt in 1953, the Catholic Church promised to preserve the remaining walls and give some public access to the ancient Inca temple. The church is indeed a mixture of two conflicting cultures. Its foundations and supporting walls are of the exquisitely carved Inca stones made out of andesite that were carved with stone tools from quarries miles away, and so finely shaped at the building site that no mortar was needed. Even today, a knife does not fit between the joints. Above the Inca masonry is a Spanish construction of roughly cut stone, put together with adobe mortar, giving the church a two-tone texture. Inside, large parts of the gilded Baroque monastery have been removed to reveal four stone chambers of the original Inca temple. Recently, the digging has produced a new phase of the centuries-old struggle between the conquistadors and the conquered of Peru, between the modern-day Roman Catholic Church and the descendants of the Incas who yielded to Francisco Pizarro in 1532. They have so many churches throughout Peru, Mr. Bajar said. Why do they have to have one right on top of the holiest Inca site? I thought this was the year when the church was apologizing for past abuses. If they abused anyone, they abused the Incas. Mr. Bajar, who is a Roman Catholic, has beliefs that have not sat well with the church hierarchy. The capricious Mr. Bajar is pretending to take down a church that has been declared a world monument by UNESCO, said the Reverend Domingo Gamara, director of the monastery. The church represents the meeting of two cultures. What he is doing is anti-Christian, and we will defend the church to the very end. Koricancha as a tourist center. In 1991, the mayor of Cusco, Mr. Daniel Estrada, tried to resurrect their besieged tourist industry, which had been hurt by outbreaks of cholera and problems with guerrilla violence. He made a very important decision to bolster the sagging tourist industry in his city that centered around the Inca ruins of Cusco and the breathtaking ruins of Machu Picchu. This is a victimized society, oppressed and suppressed for centuries, and we intend to change that by being sensitive to the Andean beliefs, Mr. Estrada said. For them, Cusco is the sacred city, but Koricancha represents his most ambitious project. Using $2 million of the municipality's funds, the mayor bought the land around the temple, tore down the existing houses, and began excavating in the area that once was the outer court. A restored Koricancha is considered to be a major piece in reviving tourism in Cusco. But if the dispute is not resolved, it may look like just nondescript ruins next to a colonial church. And what's more, the most scientifically important site of Koricancha, the central temple chamber, may never be touched by archaeologists, since it rests directly under the church's sanctuary. The monks don't want to let anyone dig because they are afraid they'll lose the property, said Professor John Rowe, an archaeologist at the University of California in Berkeley and an advisor to the Koricancha project. There are only a few monks in a huge piece of property, but no one here wants to take on the church, by Nathaniel Nash of the New York Times, 1993. Manner of construction. The Temple of Koricancha is very unique in its manner of construction compared to the other pre-Inca buildings in Cusco from its time period. First of all, the hard andesite stone blocks that are used in the construction of the temple have been dressed to such a fine degree that they fit perfectly one on top of another, almost like they were machine manufactured or poured from some ancient concrete mold. The fine dressing of these temple stones is exquisite compared to other Inca buildings of the same time period. The stones are large at the bottom, or foundation courses, and weigh maybe 1,000 pounds at most, and grow progressively smaller to a few hundred pounds as the wall courses go up in height. The finely cut nature of these stone walls are what defines the beauty of this building and the manner of construction of the temple. More time and care was taken in its construction than any other building in Peru. The construction is said to be of Egyptian style, which means that the walls are thicker at the base, between 30 to 36 inches, and go up to 28 to 24 inches at the top, giving the wall a sense of leaning, which adds strength and stability to the structure. This manner of construction has allowed the temple walls to withstand the region's earthquakes down through the centuries. So let us analyze this structure to see how uniquely it fits the required manner of construction that Nephi says was similar to the Temple of Solomon. First, the temple was built of finely dressed stones, cyclopean size. These stones are so beautifully carved that the whole wall appears as one huge stone. Secondly, the stones are laid together and so perfectly fitted that mortar was not used or required. Next, the walls are constructed in Egyptian style, thicker at the bottom. The walls were quite high. No one knows for sure how high, or if the height and dimensions were close to the same as the Temple of Solomon, but the walls were high, which added to the majesty of the building. The dressed stone walls were then covered with gold and silver panels. Also, another feature of the Temple of Solomon was the use of precious stones in the decor. Here we see the use of emeralds and turquoise stones. Not as nice as diamonds or rubies or other precious stones, but the best that the local area could produce. We find an interesting double doorway construction at all the important entrances into the various rooms. Also, large mantle stones were placed above the doorway. Again, a very Egyptian style feature of the construction. The temple had areas for doing sacrifices, washings, and rooms for ordnance work. One of the most beautiful features was the sunroom of the Holy of Holies. This semicircular room is surely the most unique feature of the Temple of Koricancha. Only the high priest officiated here in the sunroom. The roof was constructed of large wood beams covered over with straw or other thatch material to make the roof waterproof. All of these unique features of the Temple of Koricancha made Nephi say that this temple was built after the manner of the Temple of Solomon. The temple also had a large courtyard wall surrounding the temple with gardens and fountains adjoining the temple ground. Temple gardens and fountains. Today, the temple garden area is one of the most beautiful areas in the whole city. It is well maintained and planted with many flower borders. Only one fountain still flows from ancient stone pipes, but the feeling of peace and tranquility is surpassed as one visits the special garden. It is truly a refuge in the heart of Cusco, where the hustle and bustle of the city life goes on all around. Again, Graciolo, in his book, The Incas, says this about the famous gardens and fountains of Koricancha. The temple was decorated with 5 fountains that were fed from 5 different sources. Their pipes were of solid gold, and their stone pillars were covered with either gold or silver, for the sacrifices were washed in these waters. I remember the last of these fountains, which was used to water the garden of the convent that the Spaniards established on this sacred ground. One day it stopped working, to the great despair of the Indians, who, not knowing where the water came from, were unable to repair it, and the garden dried up, in spite of their desire and their efforts to save it. This only shows how quickly the Incas lost their traditions, since in the space of 42 years there was not one left who could say from whence came the waters that circulated throughout the temple of their god, the sun. In the time of the Inca, this garden, in which today the convent brothers cultivate their vegetables, was entirely made of gold and silver, and there were similar gardens about all the royal mansions. Here could be seen all sorts of plants, flowers, trees, and animals, both small and large, wild and tame, tiny crawling creatures such as snakes, lizards, and snails, as well as butterflies and birds of every size, each one of these marvels being placed at the spot that best suited the nature of what it represented. There were tall corn stalks and another stalk from the grains that they call quinoa, as well as other vegetables and fruit trees, the fruits which were all very faithfully reproduced in gold and silver. There were also in the house of the sun, as well as in that of the king, piles of wool made of gold and silver, and large statues of men, women, and children made of the same material, in addition to storeroom and recipients for storing the grain they called pura, of all which together intended to lend greater splendor and majesty to the house of their god, the sun. All of these valuable works were made by the goldsmiths attached to the temple from the tribute of gold and silver that arrived every year from all over the provinces of the empire, and which were so great that the most modest utensils used in the temple, such as pots and pans or pitchers, were also made of precious metal. For this reason, the temple and its service quarters were called Koricancha, which means place of gold. Special attributes of the temple. There are a few other features of the temple that must be discussed. First, two of the existing chambers today, chamber of the sun and the chamber of the stars and the moon, that communicate together in a line, have polygonal shaped windows high up on the walls between them. When a person stands on a stone in the floor, which has been placed there for such a purpose, then you can see through the next rooms. The stone window openings have all been lined up so perfectly to give one a sense of looking through eternity. A very interesting view created give the patron a sense that the windows keep going forever. These windows are famous and can be seen in the temple today. 5 main chambers of the Temple of the Sun. There are 5 main chambers of the Temple of Koricancha. These chambers were called by the Incas the Temple of the Sun, the Temple of the Moon, the Temple of the Stars, and the Temple of the Rainbow, and the Temple of Lightning and Thunder. All of these chambers existed, and the temple was intact and still in use when the conquistadors arrived in 1533 A.D., as witnessed and written down by the Spanish chroniclers. During the construction of the convent of Santa Domingo, it appears that the Rainbow Room, main altar, and the Lightning and Thunder Room were destroyed to obtain building materials for the new church. What remains then of the original Temple of the Sun are the 2 chambers of the moon and the stars, and then the circular sunroom. The south and western walls of the church utilized the sunroom for the walls of its construction. The rest of the convent were built over the top of the moon and star chamber, and not utilizing these walls as part of the building, at least in the last reconstruction in 1953. Even though the walls were not used for the Church of Santa Domingo, it did conceal from the world for many decades until recent excavation and restoration for the tourist industry. The sunroom. The most unique feature of the Temple of Koricancha is probably the sunroom. This semicircular room is thought to be where the high priest served and communicated with God. Today, the tour guides will point out the sundial features of the room. Shadows are cast down from special stones that have been built into the walls. These shadows tell the time of the year and the hour of the day. This information would be useful to the high priest in his leadership of the people for analysis of planting time and festival days. The construction of perfectly cut andesite stone in a round building was a very difficult feat. Only a very important and one-of-a-kind building would have such an exquisite feature, such as a round room, which is considered the most difficult form of pre-Inca architecture. The round exterior of the Temple of Koricancha is probably the most recognizable feature of the building. Even with the Church of Santa Domingo built on top of this round room, the pre-Inca construction was evident for centuries. The tunnels of Koricancha. The tunnels underneath the city of Cusco and the Temple of Koricancha have long been of major interest to archaeologists and treasure hunters alike. Even from colonial times, the Spanish suspected that the Incas hid the majority of their wealth underground in these tunnels and then purposely collapsed them on the arrival of the conquistadors. Lots of rumors and legends still circulate about this immense hidden wealth. However, to date, neither the city government or private landowners have cooperated in digging up the streets to ascertain if the ancient stories are true. The archaeological study, the Wiracocha Project, conducted conducted recently in Cusco, Peru, shows a system of tunnels which started at the Temple of Koricancha, according to Spanish archaeologist Anselm P. Rambla, using modern technology and a method called ground penetrating radar, GPR. This group of scientists from Spain, the Boac Ruz explorer, have been able to map out this interesting system of tunnels that extended north from the Temple of Koricancha to Saskatchewan. The entrance appears to be beneath the altar of Santa Rosa, which is the main altar of the temple. This series of tunnels is 5 meters deep and is of ancient design. It extends from Koricancha to the Plaza de Armas, the main city square, and then to the fortress of Saskatchewan, some 2 kilometers in length. The tunnel links the Temple of Koricancha with the convent of Santa Catalina, or Marcha Huse, with the main cathedral or temple of Inca Huiracocha, with the palace of Huascar, with the temple of Manco Capac, or Colcampata, and with Huma Marca. All of these buildings are in perfect astronomical alignment, which confirms that ancient Peruvians also guided their construction by the location of the sun, the moon, and constellation. Of course, the motivation for such work is the search for the hidden Inca treasure that eluded the Spanish and Pizarro back in 1533. It has been traditionally thought that the Incas hid the bulk of their treasure, of their temple treasure, in the deep nearby lake, or possibly buried it from falling into the hands of the European invader. These tunnels under Cusco have been abandoned and condemned for centuries and were in disrepair even before the Spaniards arrived. Everyone who entered never returned and died, so the conquistadors sealed up the entrances for safety's sake. Anselm P., the president of Boac Ruz Explorer, has said, "We know that the accumulation of metals over a long period of time in an enclosed and humid space, such as the subsoil of Cusco, can create toxic substances such as cyanide, mercury, and chloride. Inhaling these substances is probably what killed the explorers in times past, but we enter prepared." There are, for instance, stories of explorers over the centuries that have entered the tunnel. One such story tells of a young man who entered and got disoriented, but finally returned to the entrance, clutching a cob of corn made of pure gold. He died soon after, presumably poisoned by the dangerous confines of the tunnel. The cob of corn was speculated to have been part of the lost or hidden temple garden treasure. The Catholic priests had the artifact melted down and made into a crown for their bishop. The crown can still be seen on display even today. The entrances to the tunnels either no longer exist or are not accessible to the public and are now only a legend of the past. Whether or not the tunnels can be reconstructed and entered using special breathing suits and breathing air is not as important as the artifacts to be recovered. It would be very important if ancient records could be discovered, which would not only prove that the ancient pre-Columbian peoples did have a system of writing, but also that could collaborate the Book of Mormon writing. King Mosiah I probably was able to take most of his records with him to Zarahemla, so to expect any ancient records of the original Nephites is a long shot. However, Limhi and his people left the city of Nephi in haste, and the possibility of leftovers of records of his kingdom and era are a better possibility. Such records, of course, would be an invaluable find that could substantiate the entire work of Joseph Smith and the restoration. The Temple of Koricancha, the Temple of Nephi, was the crowning achievement in the life of the prophet Nephi. It was embellished and revered by succeeding generations and maintained its grandeur to colonial time, only to be destroyed by the Inquisition and the Spanish invader of the 16th century. It is part of the culture and religion of the Inca even to our modern day. We can rightly say it is still for them today the center of the universe and the navel of the world.